is 5 o'clock and we're going to get started now. I would really like to thank you for joining. I'm Nanieezh and I'm going to be your moderator for this Solve Climate by 2030 event, the Alaska version. I've been working to organize this along with Katie Spellman and Elena Sparrow. We've also had some help from the UIF Honors College Climate Scholars Program in terms of helping us to advertise the event. And I've also had some interns working to help advertise the event as well. And so today we're going to have this discussion on how to solve climate by 2030. We have 4 panelists who are going to be speaking today. We have Enei Begaye, Terry Chapin, Bruno, Nanieezh Peter, and they're going to be talking about what we can do locally to think about climate change in Alaska and what we need to do about it. So this is an event that has been, that was originally supposed to take place on the UIF campus as a live event with a remote participation option, but now for obvious reasons, we have just this remote event going on this evening. So with that, I need to give you just a few logistics of the meeting because we have a large number of participants. I have everyone muted right now, and I'm the only one that can unmute you. So even if you try to unmute yourself to say something, you have to use the hand raising function or type into the chat type into the chat if you have a question. And Katie Spellman will be moderating the or observing the chat function to see who has a question as well. So so I know that it's been difficult to focus on anything other than the pandemic in recent days, but our registration actually shows a really wide participation of people who've signed up from across Alaska and also outside of Alaska. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the pandemic effects are going to be relatively temporary, but the effects of climate change are actually not temporary. So we must continue to have action in the face of a rapidly shrinking carbon budget. And by a rapidly shrinking carbon budget, what I mean is that we can really only emit so many more fossil fuels before the average global temperature on Earth reaches something warmer than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the point at which we would likely face catastrophic effects from changes in climate. I would say that if we have one silver lining in this pandemic, it's that we can actually slow down. We've seen that we can slow down drastically in our lives and that we can limit travel and limit consumption. But of course, what climate scientists have been saying for years is that we can do all these things without the economic disaster that we're facing today. So Solve Climate is taking place across the nation today with international participation. It kicked off very early Alaska time in Germany with the Solve Climate by 2030 event over there. And so just to learn a little bit more about Solve Climate by 2030, I want to show you a video. It's about 6 minutes long, and it features Eben Goodstein, the Director of Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College. He's a colleague of mine that I've known for a while, and he roped me into all this. And he has a video here that he would like to, for me to show you that talks a little bit more about what is Solve Climate by 2030. It's about a 6-minute long video.
Climate a year ago, we could never have imagined that today entire countries and much of the world's economy would be shut down, with hundreds of thousands of people ill, thousands having passed away, and our health systems overwhelmed. I take that back. We could easily have imagined this. Our health experts and scientists warned us this was coming. After SARS and MERS, they told us this was coming, and yet we didn't take preventive action. We didn't prepare. COVID-19 has shown how fragile our health and economic systems are to extreme events. Our scientists have told us clearly that unchecked, climate change will turn our lives into an unending series of extreme events. Floods, droughts, rising sea levels, pests and disease, more extreme storms and hurricanes, all of this leaving hundreds of millions of people homeless and on the move. We can change this. We still have time to change that future. Last year, the world's top climate scientists told us that we have until 2030, 10 years now, to cut global warming pollution aggressively in order to stabilize the climate at the low end. That warning was the genesis for this national and international discussion today on how to solve climate by 2030. Solving climate in 10 years, that sounds challenging. And yet fixing the energy half of climate change by 2030 is looking more, not less likely than it was 4 years ago. The cost of solar and wind power, batteries, and electric vehicles have plummeted. In many cases, they are less expensive now than the fossil fuel power that causes global warming, and they're getting cheaper every day. Already, utility scale wind and solar, big solar and wind farms that feed power into the grid, these technologies are crushing fossil fuels in much of the US. In Colorado, Idaho, and California, renewable bids are coming in at half the price that the cheapest fossil fuel plants can do. And this is where rooftop solar and battery systems are headed in the near future. On the vehicles front, all the major manufacturers see this coming. Mercedes-Benz announced last fall that they have designed their last gasoline-powered car. Going forward, every new model of theirs will be electric. Combining electric-powered vehicles with the impact of driverless technology, we could see a very rapid transition away from gasoline-based cars to EVs in the next decade. All this progress was the result of a major technology push by national governments, starting in America in the 70s and then ramping up with the Danes, the British, the Japanese and Koreans, the Germans, and most recently, the Chinese and Indians. Government policies have brought these industries to scale, and now the market is taking over, and renewables, battery storage, and electric vehicles are on track to deliver power and transportation at prices unsubsidized that will lead to major disruptions of energy markets in the 2020s. Can we get there fast enough to solve climate? Well, this is where you come in. With plummeting prices for renewables and electric-powered transports, the pace of the clean energy revolution will no longer be determined by Washington, D.C. and other national governments. Instead, the core action is going to be in your city, at your electric utility, and in your state capital. The key to solving climate by 2030 will be clearing the path at the local level to rapid deployment of solar, wind, battery storage, and electric vehicles. We need to get rid of outmoded laws and regulations that are holding back the transition. Florida needs to take the lesson from Georgia. It's imperative that we have justice in this transition. We have to make sure that the millions of green jobs that are created are jobs for all, and that everyone has access to clean, affordable power and mobility. Today, in Nebraska and New Jersey, in Idaho and Alabama, in Bangladesh and Brazil, we're going to find out what are 3 ambitious but feasible things that we can do right at home to smooth the path for clean energy and to bring energy justice to our communities. Following the webinar, I hope you will join a group or class discussion about what you can do to make these solutions real. Then, what next? Well, this summer, young people in particular have a terrific opportunity to both support climate solutions and gain valuable job skills in a down economy. The most powerful thing you can do to solve climate by 2030 is to join the political campaign of a candidate who best represents your views on climate solutions. In doing that, you'll also learn how to communicate, you'll gain courage, and most importantly, be part of a creative, strong, powerful vision for the future. COVID-19 is giving us a stark lesson about what happens when we ignore warnings from science. Today, we'll see how 10 years can be enough time to drive the climate solutions that we need, and that the future will be what we make it. Thank you for the work you will do to solve climate.
Okay, so I hope you were all able to see the video. Were you mostly able to see the video? I know there was a problem with the sound in the beginning, and I think it got straightened out. So in case you didn't actually see the video or get that, the premise is we have this rapidly shrinking carbon budget. We have 10 years to avoid catastrophic warming, and we need local solutions. We can't really rely on global solutions for this. We need to act locally. And so that's what brings us to this Solve Climate by 2030 event. It's being hosted by all sorts of different universities across the nation. 45 states are participating, plus international sites. And so our first panelist for this evening is Enei Begaye. She's executive director from the Native movement. And she has her slides that she's going to show and talk about. So Enei, welcome.
Unmute my. Okay. We can back up for a little bit. First, I just want to recognize that I am zooming in from the territories of the Lower Tanana Dene Athabascan peoples here in Alaska, known now as Fairbanks. And I yat edo hehet kachitni nishlan do to ojini bashichin do ashendashanella. I'm Navajo and Thanaatham, so I'm not Alaska Native, but I feel a lot of thanks and gratitude to the peoples of this territory whose land I reside on now, and would like to recognize do that land acknowledgement as a recognition of the historical caretaking and stewardship and relationship to the land here that was done by the Indigenous peoples of this territory, but and that continues to be done by the Indigenous peoples of this territory. I guess I want to start by simply saying, well, first I just want to say, like, it's been a little rough. I've got a lot of raw edges actually right now because of a lot of harsh news in our communities lately, and so I think the biggest point that I want to add to this conversation really is that the crisis of climate change began with the onset of colonialism, the onset of taking of lands and resources. And so in order to really address this crisis of climate change, we must address the injustices that have happened, that continue to happen. And in order to adjust those, in addressing those, we build healing. And healing is what we need in order to move forward, not as people and as for the earth. And so in thinking about colonialism, I just wanted to touch base really quick. These are some of the slides I pulled up very quickly, and you can see the taking of native lands. And this is, of course, lower 48, not Alaska, and the shrinking of native lands to today. And I think that there's a direct correlation in this taking to the impacts and urgency and crisis of climate change. I'm not sure how to move the slides.
Next slide. Just say next slide and I'll change it right over for you.
And so as we think about climate change and addressing climate change, it's really important for us to remember these roots. And you can see here a picture of a visual kind of artist's rendition of Manifest Destiny. And this is this notion that it was God's given right for white landowning Christian men to take land and resources. And so what you see in this picture is, you know, the dark side of the picture being what is wild, what is savage, being moved away by what is the light, which is, you know, technology and the laying of these tracks and the settling of land. And I think this is a key piece of what our systems of inequity and systems of climate crisis are really based on. And this picture has been in numerous history books for years and years, depicting a kind of a normalization of the taking of resources and the moving of people, a normalization of these injustices. Next slide. So colonialism, you press it again, and I just wanted to make sure everybody had the kind of same language. I know you thought you were getting on a climate change conversation, and I think this is deeply tied to climate change, right? This notion of colonialism. And so for those of you, we'll just get on the same page here, right? The policy or practice of acquiring political control over another country land, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. This is, I think, the crux of what we're at with climate change, the exploitation of resources that exacerbates greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. I'll go through these fairly quickly, I think. So, if we're talking about colonialism, we have to point to the first, the type of colonialism in this country being practiced as settler colonialism. And so settler colonialism here, right, as a definition from Tuck and Yang, settlers are not immigrants. Immigrants are beholden to the indigenous laws and epistemologies, that's a ways of knowing, of the lands they migrate to. Settlers become the land, supplanting indigenous laws and epistemologies. Epistemologies, again, being ways of knowing, ways of being. And so, again, pointing to this as a kind of center or seed of inequity and cycles out of balance. Next slide. Which resulted in kind of in this notion of settler colonialism, of colonization, resulted in the forced assimilation and genocide of peoples not only in this country but across the world, all for the purpose of taking resources. Again, this is one of the first boarding schools in the country. In the US, it was a model boarding school for Native boarding school for I think there was 27 boarding schools, and this system of boarding schools wasn't just kept in the 1800s. This system of boarding school continued on all the way to my father's generation, right? And so this perpetuation of like assimilating Native people, moving Native people off of their lands in order to access resources for the purpose of colonization is at the crux of what we face today, climate change. Next slide. And colonization, just again for folks to see some definitions, is that process of devaluing and dehumanizing Native people through both formal and informal methods in order to justify exploiting them in their homelands. Next slide. And this is deeply tied to the doctrine of discovery. These are Catholic laws that are still they have never been redacted, I guess. So the papal bulls gave white Christian men the right to made it law that it was okay for this taking of resources, not only of land resources, but of human resources. And I'll say, and this doctrine of discovery is deeply embedded within our U.S. federal Indian policies. It's deeply embedded in really all of the foundations and fabric of our country. And so I bring that up because, yeah, we've got some deep digging to go to. So next slide. Let's see. So how does that relate to climate change? Well, let's take a look. If you can see this slide, this is North America at night from the satellite. And you can see these spots you can see the metropolises, right? That's these areas with bright lights. We can see where LA would be. We can see where San Francisco, New York. And if you go all the way to the top left side of your screen there, you can see Alaska way up there. And if you go up to the top of Alaska, you can see a lot of bright lights up there too. I bet you didn't know that we had a whole thriving metropolis at the top of Alaska. Well, we don't. That's the flaring of oil and gas resources on the north slope of Alaska. That is the direct correlation between the taking of our resources and the installation of colonialism and assimilation into practice that has been directly correlating to the increase of climate change. Next slide. And so when we're addressing climate change, and we're not addressing, and we must be addressing injustices as well, because not only is there a direct correlation between the taking of land, there's also a direct correlation to the violence against people, the violence against women in particular. And so that's what this artwork speaks to, just the violence against the land has been a direct violence to Indigenous bodies as well, both historically and presently. You see the direct increase of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, of domestic violence, of these also injustices. Next slide. So how do we stop this? How do we address climate change and all of these injustices? I mean, I believe we have to address climate change by also addressing all of these injustices, right? And so when we are stopping the bad, and so these are just a few of some of the calls to action by people across this state and other states demanding protection of hunting and fishing areas, of land and water, protection of our bodies. This is also a direct work of stopping climate change. Next slide. So we have to stop the bad, and we have, oh, I'm missing some pictures. Oh, wow.
Yeah, sorry, some of those didn't transfer over.
Oh, it's okay. And we have to build the new. On top of stopping the bad, we have to build the new. And so this is some like gardening projects that are in, like, what are those things, those train, those cargo shipment containers. I also had some other pictures that I guess didn't come through, but when we're talking about building the new, we have to also remember that Indigenous cultures have lived in relationship to the lands that they live on for millennia, for thousands of years. And so we don't necessarily have to start anew, right? There is a science, indigenous science, that continues to be practiced, and that information, that science, that knowledge must be at the table, must be at the forefront of helping to inform strategies going forward. And so this could be also things like solar and efficient home building, and these practices that reduce carbon emissions. But we also don't have to, we also need to look back, not go back, but we have to look back at ways of being, of ways of living that lived in harmony with our environment. Next slide. So we have to stop the bad, we have to build the new, we have to change the rules. So there are here's some pictures of different policy initiatives that have happened. And when I say change the rules, it's not just changing the rules for green energy, but also in the top left here is the picture of Governor Walker signing the Alaska Native Languages Act, making Alaska Native languages official languages of the state. That is also a huge piece of changing the rules. When we're acknowledging other languages, when we're uplifting particularly the languages that have embedded within them the relationship to the land, have knowledge systems within them for that. Okay, and then so changing the rules, right? We've got to be actively engaged in these policies that make it easier not only for communities that we need to be a part of changing the rules for all communities to be able to have access to new energy sources, clean energy sources, right? And actively opposing distracted by kids in my house. More kids in my house.
Yeah, we have 4.
Anyway,
We understand. It's just part of the deal here tonight.
You can see the picture. But when I think about changing the rules and I think about building justice and equity into that, we have to also be thinking about how communities that can't afford to put solar energy systems in to their communities, or how do renters put solar energy into their homes? I mean, how are we building justice and equity into every step that we're taking? Next slide. And we have to be willing to move the resources towards more just and equitable avenues, right? So that means each of us also having to think about what privilege we have and how we're going to leverage that privilege. Or another way of thinking of it might be also that we have to think about what are we willing to give up, particularly for those of us who have benefited off of the settler colonial system. What are we willing to give up in order to move resources where they need to go, so that we can actually achieve balance again. Next slide. We need to get behind movements. We need to get behind people who are organizing in mass to build people power to change the systems, because the climate change is a systemic problem, just as much as it is a climate or environmental issue. It is deeply tied to a systemic crisis built off of colonization. So you can see just some of these pictures of people in the streets, and not just in the streets. I think these same people have been in the hallways of our legislators' offices. And so getting involved and getting behind and supporting these movements is just as important. Next slide. What do I have? Okay.
You have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, I'm gonna quickly go through this. There's some things to think about as we're building the solutions and to address climate change is really having clarity on what we know we need, right? There's that green circle. And then also knowing what are the false solutions. What are the things that are pitched to us as solutions that might also be perpetuating, but might still be perpetuating colonial injustices or imbalance, right? And so having clarity on that, and then also knowing there's another, press the next thing, there's knowing what's politically realistic. This is a tool from a group called Movement Generation that kind of helps you to organize, right? We got to know also what's politically realistic, but it's important to remember that what's politically realistic, we have it in dotted lines there because it's malleable, because politically realistic is dependent on us, right? We create what's politically realistic, and I think we can mobilize through people power. And so there's some little arrows in there. You can just keep hitting the thing.
Oh no.
And that just reminds us that we have to be creative in our solution making. It might not be politically realistic at this time, but we have to be creative. Otherwise, we have no idea how to bring that politically realistic into that part of the sphere. We have to codify, we have to continue to utilize pieces of what is politically realistic and that are solutions, like Alaska Native languages. We have to put those now into school systems. We have to continue to use these things, otherwise they get taken away from us. We have to be changing the governing systems, and we have to be actively opposing the false solutions and exposing the false solutions that might not seem politically realistic. Next slide. No. And there's some principles that I'll just point to. I'm not, well, did they not come up? There's maybe press the next arrow. Okay. There's a website, and probably the next arrow too, because there's a little more at the bottom. But there's a website, Indigenous Environmental Network has some principles of a just transition. So all of what I've been talking about in terms of just transition is what I just explained, that transition is inevitable, right? And we know this because we're living in a transition right now. We are, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we're in a transition, and it's important for us to remember that any of this transition, we have to have justice and equity. It's not just going to happen. We have to actually be a part of making justice and equity happen. And so that's the basics of just transition and kind of some of the strategies to get there I shared earlier. So this is some Indigenous environmental networks principles that affirm the need to restore Indigenous lifeways, recognize Indigenous knowledge, be very wary of market-based mechanisms that continue to commodify Mother Earth, and the recognition of Indigenous rights and food sovereignty There are more, and they're on their website, and there's, if you click one more, I think their website pops up, but
Yeah,
yeah.
there it is.
So ienearth.org, you can find their more infos. We'll leave with some, I'm going to wrap up with some beautiful guiding principles from another organization called Movement Generation. They have one more. And as we're thinking of solutions, as we're working towards addressing these injustices, it's important to remember that what the hands do, the heart learns. So while we're at our computer warrioring along via computer keyboards, or I don't know, installing renewable energy, whatever we're doing, like let's remember that what we're doing, our heart learns. So let's remember to also like get out and do the things that we love, that are part of, that's also part of shaping the world we want. If it's the right thing to do, we have every right to do it. If we are not prepared to govern, we are not prepared to win. And if it's not soulful, it's not strategic. So these are some of the principles that we love to organize by. I'm a community organizer. Our organization is a community organizing entity that really tries to engage our community in solution building. Next slide. And then there's the Nanieezh principles. There's a lot, I'm not going to read all of those, but folks should definitely check out the Nanieezh principles as we're working to build justice and equity into climate solutions. This is one of the guiding principle documents that really helps people in partnerships and coalitions continue strongly together, right? So please check that out. And this was, people might have seen this image before, but we've got this big climate change, fish coming after all of us, basically. And we've got to get organized in order to address this issue. And that can be difficult, but so the next slide is kind of getting us all together so that we can get at that big fish to address climate change. And so that's part of our community organizing motto, I guess, is really bringing people power together so that we can address these issues. And at the core, like I said, we've got to be willing to build justice and equity into it. We've got to be addressing injustices, and we've got to be building healing into that. And I think those are critical for us to be able to address climate change by 2030, because whether or not we have solar panels on everyone's homes by 2030, if we're still perpetuating a system of injustice, where we will still be perpetuating climate change in one way or another. So I think that's the end of my slides.
Yeah, it is. Thank you, Enei. That's great. I like that last cartoon a lot too. So we're going to save questions until the end, and we'll move on to Terry. So Terry is yes, thank you, Terry. Terry is a professor emeritus at UAF, and you probably all know Terry. I don't think he needs much introduction. So Terry, take it away.
Thanks, Eugenie. And thank you, Enei, for laying out the acknowledgement of the land and the issues that Alaska Native people face. I really feel fortunate to be able to live in this land and to be able to know many Native people. I feel like I've learned as much about climate change from Alaska Native people as I have from Western science. And that's largely because the challenges of climate change are not so much the scientific challenges, but the challenges of values and changing the values that we have as a society. And there's one of the things I've learned here in Alaska is the importance of respect, the importance of understanding the reciprocity among people, reciprocity between people and nature. And that comes really strongly from Alaska Native values. And those kinds of values need to inform what society broadly does in order to stop climate change. That's where we're at. Next slide, please. And it's not just the injustices that happen within Alaska. As Enei pointed out, it's a global issue. This map shows the footprint of our resource use by country. And you can see that some countries are bloated because they use much more than their share of the resources, where other countries are shrunk because they don't have the opportunity to use the resources because the resources move to rich countries. And so just to make that concrete, the average person in a developed nation uses 32 times more resources than the person in a developing nation. That means that those of us in a place like the United States or Alaska are using more than our share of resources, which also means that we can do more to reduce resource consumption and the impact of resource consumption on the climate than can people in many, many other parts of the world. So it's really our responsibility to reduce our resource consumption and to reduce the rates of climate change, but also we're poised and in position to do that more effectively than people in developing nations. So it's our job to do. Next slide, please. And I think a lot of this, as was said in the introductory talk, comes down to the actions of individuals, what we can do. Government's been talking about climate change for decades, and they haven't gotten us there yet. And that's because it's the actions of individuals that are really going to move the needle from here on out. If people don't say what they believe, say what they feel is important to them, then government has no motivation to take action. And so there's things we can do as individuals. We can engage in conversations to define common goals across society. And we can collaborate together to work together on these things. And then, as Enei was saying, we need to shape social and political change. It's a political issue as much as an individual issue. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. So there's a couple of kinds of individual actions I'd like to emphasize. One is just downright fun. It's celebrating the connections that we have with nature. As I mentioned earlier, we really need to understand the value of the reciprocal interactions between people and nature. And part of this is understanding and celebrating the wonderful things that happen, that nature provides for us. It gives us our sense of place, our sense of identity. And one of the most important ways to do this is connecting families with families and friends in nature, doing things in nature, helping other people understand why nature is so much fun and why it's so important to us. And then finding ways to build and sustain these values across generations. And next slide. So I'd like to just give you a personal story about this. This is the last 6 generations of my family, beginning with my great-grandfather and my grandfather in the upper left. My great-grandfather was the 3rd generation of families that lived in New York City. And you might not think that they thought much about nature, but every summer they went on vacation, and my great-grandfather took my grandfather fishing. And my grandfather, for the rest of his life, loved fishing. And he took his kids out in nature, and they went camping along the river. They went to lakes. And then my parents took my sister and brother and I to pick huckleberries, to go fishing and do things outside. And then in the lower right, you can see the things that we've done with our kids in Alaska. And it's hard not to enjoy nature in Alaska. It's just a wonderful place to live. I feel privileged to be here. Now, my son, who grew up there in Alaska, has now moved to Cardiff, Wales. So he lives in a city again, and his kids live in a city, but they still really enjoy getting out in nature. And so what I want to emphasize is it's these connections across generations that are important. The ways to convey these values across generations. And that means immersing people in nature in whatever way you do it. Taking people to parks, taking people to the zoo, going out and going canoeing or kayaking. There's lots of ways to participate in nature and to have chances to enjoy that. Next slide, please. So the other part of finding a respectful relationship between people and nature is deciding what we want and need and pursuing less consumptive pathways towards happiness. I think all of us want to be happy. We don't want to live a life of self-sacrifice, but there's so many non-consumptive ways in which we can be happy, in which we can find satisfaction, like all the ways of being outside, as I was just talking about a minute ago. But another part of this is to reduce those aspects of consumption that are not necessary. This doesn't mean that that we should stop consuming things. We all need to consume resources in order to live from one day or year or generation to the next. But we can think about which aspects of consumption really matter to us. And this comes back to the values of what it is that we value. It could be that we value the food that's produced locally, the food that comes from nature. It could be that we value the pottery that friends of ours make, or we value the local stores that are run by local people in order to support our community. But there's lots of things that most of us buy, that all of us buy probably, that we don't really need or maybe don't even want. Next slide, please. So, and this involves shifting social norms. Social norms are the values that we learn about socially. We learn about it from our neighbors. We learn about it from our family. And some of these values support a pattern of consumption that isn't really healthy. It encourages us to consume more than we want to. And a lot of the things that we buy are purchased not because we want them, but we make these decisions unconsciously because we're conforming to the behavior of groups of people that we respect and we want to be respected by them, or we're conforming to the values of people that we would like to emulate, whose behavior we would like to copy. And I want to tell you about a really cool experiment that I learned about that was done by a group of social psychologists. They were working with the hotel industry and the hotels asked them to suggest ways in which they could encourage their guests to reuse their towels from one day to the next, rather than always taking a new towel for every new day they stayed in the hotel. And they tried several different messages as ways to encourage people to reuse their towels. One message was just simply saying, please reuse your towel. Others tied a motivation to this. Please reuse your towels to save the environment, to reduce your impacts on the environment. Another message was, we'll give you $5 for every day you reuse your towel, an economic motivation. Another message was, most people in this hotel reuse their towels. Why don't you do the same? And the final message was, the last people who used this room reused their towels. Why don't you do the same? And the messages which had the greatest effect were those that related to conformity. It was messages that said, other people have reused their towels. Why don't you do that? Especially people who've used this same room. And so the other messages that people were making their choices and behaving based on their conforming to other people's things. So how is it that we can change social norms so that they're more supportive of reducing rates of climate change? Now, luckily, it should be pretty easy to do this. The norms that are easiest to change are those behaviors that we can observe easily. So some of the norms that you can observe easily are things like bicycling, recycling, no smoking, in other words, having respect for your neighbors. Those are positive norms. And so if we exhibit those behaviors, even if we never talk to people, it will encourage other people to do the same thing. Other norms that are easy to change, relatively easy to change, are those negative norms associated with conspicuous consumption. Buying fancy clothes, buying a new car more often than we might need, buying a bigger house that we might need. These are things that often motivate a lot of the consumption that happens in society, not because we need to do these things, not because we want them in order to be comfortable, but because we want to copy the behavior of other people whose respect we would like to have. Now, we can make our choices as to what we really care about, and maybe those aren't the things we really care about. So if we can shift social norms, then we can change the behavior towards behavior that's more favorable towards climate. And we have to do this now. As Eugenie said at the start, we've got 10 years to get our act together as a society. And one of the most effective ways to do this is through shifting of social norms, because it's people like us that can make this happen. It's not something that government can do, although they can certainly change the incentive structure. Can I go back to the last slide, Eugenie?
Yes. Oops, sorry, that wasn't it. That's it.
Yes, this is it. So, oops, no.
Not that one either. Oh dear.
The last one. Oh, you're going the wrong direction.
Going the wrong.
There we go. Stop. No, stop. No.
Next.
Well, I'll just talk about it. It was a slide that shows the kinds of things that are often suggested as ways to reduce rates of climate change. Things like recycling and washing clothes in cold water, things of that sort. And these are the kinds of things that have a relatively small impact on the climate system. Some of the things that have a really big impact are things like deciding whether or not to have another, there we go, start. Deciding whether or not to have another child. Or because each person in the United States has 32-fold more impact on consumption of resources than a person in a developing nation. Deciding not to have a car, deciding to use renewable energy rather than fossil fuel energy, deciding to use a meat-free diet. Things of that sort can really have a big impact. And these are all choices that each of us can make individually. And what's more, these are things that each of us can, we can try these things out and decide whether how well it fits our lifestyle and our behavior and what we care about as an individual or a family. So, for example, we might have my wife and I have 2 children, and we could have chosen to have a 3rd child, but we chose not to. Many people who live in cities now to decide that having a car of their own is not worth it. It's less expensive and more convenient to not to have to own a car. Or you might, if you do own a car, you might choose to use it only 2 or 3 days a week rather than every day of the week. We can certainly choose to have a meat-free diet 2 or 3 days a week or 1 day a week even, and just see how well that fits the preferences of our family. And then if it seems like a good thing to do, then we can shift our behavior more towards a climate friendly behavior. So these are the kinds of things that we can do. Okay, next slide, please. I'm almost afraid to ask for that.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So another thing that we can do is to talk to other people about it. Now, 75% of people in the United States never talk to anybody about climate change over the course of a year. Now, if people never talk to one another about climate change, how are you ever going to convince other people that this is important? Now, some people, like Catherine Hayhoe, who's a wonderful climate scientist, says that this is the most important thing that an individual can do, is simply talk to other people about climate change, why it matters to you, why you are worried about climate change and what there is that you or they can do about it. So just talking with people can be really important, but it's important to do this in a respectful way, to look for the common ground, things that you agree about rather than focusing on the things that you disagree about, focusing on solutions rather than blaming other people for what's going on. Now, sometimes these conversations happen between people who have fairly similar ideas, and that's an important thing to do. 60% of people in the United States identify themselves as environmentalists, but not all of us behave in climate-friendly ways. So even if we just talk to people who have very similar attitudes to what we have, we can make a lot of progress towards more climate-friendly behavior by taking actions that would shift social norms. But some of the more difficult conversations, for example, by people who may be skeptical about whether humans have any impact on climate change, maybe those conversations are best had with people who those people respect, perhaps their families. Now, young conservatives are often very effective in talking to their parents and relatives about climate change. They are much more likely to have taken courses in climate change than their parents did. So there are other people who can help us out who may have slightly different values and approaches to things that we do. We don't have to convince everybody, but there's a lot of people who I think we can convince compellingly. Okay, next slide, please. And going to Enei's last point, we need to take political action. Part of this is just fulfilling our normal citizen responsibilities to inform ourselves about what's going on, rather than just listening to what's fed to us on social media, to vote. Most national elections are decided by half or less of the voters in the United States. If we simply got out there and voted for what we believed in, we could change things in one election cycle. There's also many opportunities to participate in government by informing, consulting, and advising, lobbying and advocating with political leaders, or taking leadership ourselves, and challenging the inequities that exist, protesting the things that are inappropriate. And when a crisis like the virus crisis that's happening now come up, this causes big changes. It really upsets things and makes some things possible that may not have been easy to change in the past. So we should be thinking now about how to use the current crisis to shift towards more climate-friendly action. Next, please. So what are Alaskans best poised to do? Well, we can tell our story. There's lots of ways in which climate impacts people in Alaska, and we can tell that story about how climate change is affecting people today and how these kinds of changes are going to be happening to more and more people if climate continues to change. We can reduce our own unnecessary consumption. We have a higher rate of energy use than people in any other state. And as I've mentioned, people in the United States have a very high rate of consumption of resources. We can engage our leadership. We happen to have, there's very few citizens per US senator for Alaska compared to most other states. So we have greater chances to influence national politics than citizens of most states would do. And we can adapt and help others adapt, and we can do things to diversify our economy. Next slide, please. So what are you gonna do? What am I gonna do? Well, first of all, I think it's important that each of us decide that it's our responsibility. We have to do something. I have to do something. And most of us are already doing things. So it's not a question of feeling guilty about the things you're not doing, but being proud of what you are doing and thinking about the next thing you might want to tackle. And in terms of deciding what that might be, you can think about what kinds of actions would have the biggest impact. But I think you can also think about what is it that fits with your skills and your passions. What are you going to want to do anyway that would make a difference? And you can think about who do you want to talk to about this? Who is it that needs to know about the things that you care about with respect to climate change. And then my last slide. So I'm cautiously optimistic. Bad situations like the one we're in today breed so many opportunities to make things better. And there's lots of groups that are doing great things. And so we know the things that need to be done to stop climate change by 2030. And we know that each of those steps is feasible. So the challenge is to take action, to shift our values, shift social norms, and then to integrate that and scale it up. And we can't wait for somebody else to solve the problem. It's really our challenge to do it ourselves. It's our job. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. That was great. And so if you have questions for Terry or Enei, please feel free to type them into the chat, and we're going to be collecting those questions and trying to answer as many of them at the end of this as we can. So now we're going to move along to Bruno, who's president of the Cold Climate Housing Research Center here in Fairbanks. And he's going to have yet another different viewpoint on all this.
Well, good evening. I'm hoping everyone can hear me at this point. Yeah, I'm of course, having this conversation with you from my home, and you will hear in the background the whole family. They're doing their best to kind of keep it down here. But yeah, I do live here in Fairbanks. I work at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, and really thank you, Eugenie, Enei, and Terry for building up this conversation. Again, I'm Bruno. I'm not from Alaska, but I got here as quickly as I could. I am the president of the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, which is here in Fairbanks, just adjacent to the university. I don't call myself an expert, but I gladly share with you what I do know. I want to acknowledge as well that the Cold Climate Housing Research Center works throughout traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples of Alaska. And our research center is on the homeland of the lower Tanana, Enei, Athabascan people. And we thank and acknowledge the first Alaskans for the ancestral and present land stewardship and place-based knowledge. And I don't say that lightly because that folds in to everything. And you hear this in Enei's message, you hear this in Terry's message, you can hear it in mine. There are many angles to tackle climate change, and I'm here to tell you our angle. And also bringing back that first video, I really like that video. There's some great points that were brought out during that video, not related directly to my talk, but we were recently at the National Renewable Energy Lab about a month and a half ago. And where I learned that really the technology, the green technology, wind and solar energy, it's ready. The market is there. Everything's there. That we just have to overcome legislative hurdles. In the central states like Colorado, for instance, wind turbines are dispatched, used before any other forms of energy because it's the cheapest form of electricity in those areas. It means they use it before they turn on nuclear or anything else. So that gave me a lot of hope. Anyway, let's go to the next slide, please. So some of you in this audience have heard this story, but it really is the cornerstone to why I do some of these things. These are my two. This is Russell and Annabelle. You can probably hear them right now in the background. And 2 years ago, when the California wildfires were happening, I put Annabelle to bed and read the story, did the whole rigmarole. And as I kissed her goodnight, she said, "Dad, I can't sleep." I said, "What's the deal?" You know, she says, "Well, I'm worried about climate change." I said, "Well, what do you mean you're worried about climate change?" "Well, I'm worried about the wildfires and all of this." And she says, I said, "Sweetheart, you know, we're not here to worry about it. We're problem solvers. That's it, you know." She says, "Okay." She says, "Yeah, what if we went back to horse and carriage? Would that be a good idea?" I said, yeah, it's a good idea." She says, "Well, what do you do to combat climate change?" And I was thinking, this is a slow pitch softball, right? I'm an underhand softball answer, right? And so, I kind of went through that. Almost half the energy in this country goes towards energy that goes to buildings. So we go read, and of course the energy that's used, it creates off greenhouse gases. And so we're trying to reduce the amount of energy we use to reduce greenhouse gases. And I thought I was doing the dad thing. I got it nailed. And she looks at me after about 5 seconds of silence, and she goes, she's thinking about my office where I'm staring at this computer like I'm staring with you all right now. And she goes, "Wait, what does staring at a plastic screen all day have anything to do with climate change?" So we're all staring at the plastic screen right now and trying to address climate change. So thank you, Annabelle, for that. Let's go to the next slide, please. So CCHRC works across the circumpolar north to address housing issues. And our approach is to solve the climate change, solving the climate change problem is to focus on energy efficiency. We've got 33 communities that are in Alaska that are identified as being immediately threatened by climate change. And this threatens sewer and water infrastructure, roads, runways, power systems, schools, and homes. So, in one way, a lot of these places, you're burning in a lot of these places, you're burning oil and to keep yourself warm. And of course, inadvertently, like we do with our cars and all the homes you're in right now, the houses that keep you warm are also contributing to the problem. So go ahead and hit the next slide. Thinking about the basic needs of people, food, water, shelter, this is shelter, this is housing. And really housing doesn't just stop with shelter. It also encompasses the health and the lives of those who live here. And you can see, it's so easy to see how we're impacted by climate change. In the picture you're seeing here, look at the Fairbanks, 97 degrees. We have houses that are falling into the river. The most famous one right now, the famous community right now is New Talk falling into the sea. And it's moving about 6 miles upriver to a new location called Mukvik. Bottom left corner here, this is housing. A lot of this housing was California HUD housing. It was brought in to help people of Alaska. We have a solution for you. We're going to help you. We're going to bring in California HUD housing. You're welcome. Here's housing. And I'm glad you're grateful because, you're welcome. And so what I mean by that, and being a little facetious, is that these solutions were brought to people who need them. And in this case, this is a house in Quinnahock. It was without any input or say from the people who would live there, who know the land. And this is the result. Imagine bringing California HUD housing into the north of the Arctic Circle, or even just to Alaska, period. This is what you get. And now it becomes it's not shelter anymore, it's unhealthy shelter. So what's worse, right? Next page. Again, this is Galena. This is a flood in 2015. This is going to happen more. This year, you know what, right now we had a really cold winter. The ice is really thick this year, and we've got a really big snowpack right now. And when that ice goes out in the next month, we're going to see more of this. And already the flags are waving and the warning signals are out. And there are going to be communities out there. But what happens is as the ice breaks up in the wintertime and in the spring, all the ice ideally just trickles down the river into the ocean and it's all said and done. But what can happen is it can all clump together. And within a matter of hours, it creates a dam. And within a matter of hours, it can flood an entire community called an ice jam. And it can ruin homes. So if this happens, more people are going to be displaced. Go ahead and hit the next slide. More people are going to be displaced. And with this COVID-19 issue, communities like Fairbanks and Anchorage, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be, it is a problem already, but it's just going to compound in ways we don't even know. And if you were following the news today, here in Alaska, any semblance of homeless programs in Alaska just got slashed and burned. So we're talking epic issues here. But this is important because we engage with the Office of Naval Research sometimes. They brought up to me once that climate change is a national security threat because it displaces people. So if you think about sea level rise in, say, Florida, you have people who don't have a place to live, and now you can have civil unrest. That's the concern there. And so it's a national security threat. So what they're looking at, and they've come to us, and they say, what about quick build solutions for the sake of national security? And we're working with them, but it also needs to be affordable. It needs to be something that is energy efficient for the sake of the people and for the sake of the earth. Next slide, please. And let's not forget about the people. We focus on energy efficiency, but we need to make sure that whatever solutions we bring to the table also support, as Enei said, justice, equity, and human dignity. Dignity, and it doesn't just mean we come solve a problem, you know. And we look to the first Alaskans. First Alaskans were adaptable for 15,000 years. First Alaskans lived sustainably, and then when the resources changed, people adapted and changed their ways. And there are lessons there. As Enei said, let's not go back, but let's look back. So when we work with rural Alaska, at least here with the Research Center, we don't come with all the answers. Our goal is to come humbly upon invitation. And then we ask, you know, how can we work together to merge traditional knowledge with 21st century technology? Next slide, please. So, excuse me. We have a shortage of housing. Right now, just, you know, in Alaska, there are 10,000 homes that need to be built right now. How do we go about solving this in a constructive way that also addresses climate change and sustainability? Let's look at the next slide, please. This is what we call a holistic approach, and it's what we're doing right now. That means bringing all the different viewpoints. We all sit down at the table together. That means we have a dialogue. We're invited in. We never come to the table with all of the answers. We create those solutions together. And nobody here is coming to the table, not Terry, not Enei, not Nanieezh, not I, with all of the answers. But together and with you, we're gonna take a step in the right direction. Let's look at the next slide, please. So this is a house. Many of you, if you're in Alaska, you may have seen this. It's an example of the process. An example of this holistic approach was used to create this house. The average house here in Alaska uses about 1,400 gallons of fuel a year. The true cost of that's about $10 a gallon. A lot of the subsidized no one actually pays that necessarily, but the average house does use 1,400 gallons of fuel oil. So those are the units of heat measurement, you know, or energy use we use up here in a lot of locations. This house here uses about 15 to 20% of that. It's not, the celebration isn't that we were able to create a house that was just super energy efficient. It was one that works culturally, works with logistics. It was the right place. It used the fewest resources. And this process was repeated in Buckland, Galena, Bethel, Cricket Creek, Point Lake, 28 different communities throughout the state. Not only is it cost effective, but it reduces energy, ergo greenhouse gases. Let's look at the next slide, please. This is an example that, of course, this approach works with rural and urban settings. This is the Sustainable Village. This is student housing here off the UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. These houses use about 75 to 80% less energy than their counterparts, and it's all built at typical market cost. Again, focusing on the energy reduction. Next slide, please. Okay. Looking at renewable energy is one way to approach it. And I want to just compare renewable solutions to energy efficiency, and this is the way I like to do it. Right here in Fairbanks, if I were to just take a couple of solar collectors, in this case, this is one that's offsetting hot water. 2 of those collectors installed, about $6,500 to install. And what it offsets is about 170 gallons of fuel a year. There's the payback there is about 9.5 years, okay, if you care about the payback. But what I want you to hold in your mind when I go through these next slides is that 170 gallons. Because what I want you to understand is the energy efficiency improvements you can make to buildings can far offset, or you can see the respective offset you would get to installing a couple of solar panels. Next slide, please. We'll go through them quickly. This is a house here in Fairbanks that incorporates energy efficiency standards. There's also solar thermal on there. And some of the decisions that were incorporated into this house, it's a net zero ready house. But we're going to walk through some of those decision-making tools. Go ahead, next please. Rather than taking our standard 2x6 wall, which is pretty common throughout the country, we said, well, what if we were to turn this R19 wall into an R70 wall? It offsets, just the building envelope alone offsets 323 gallons. Not quite double what that solar system was offset. Next slide. What if, in this case, we went with the triple pane instead of double pane windows? Again, 77 gallons of fuel oil we've just offset by that choice. Excellent. What about air sealing? Air sealing, you have these cracks in your house. Warm air rises and goes through any kind of leak points above your head and bringing in cool air in the lower part of the house. It really doesn't cost a lot of money to tighten up your house, and but just by tightening up the house to something that we would call, I don't have to get into specifics of it here, but make it a tight house, we could save 138 gallons of fuel for this specific house. And all of these are specific to that house I showed you at the beginning. Next slide. What about roof insulation? What if we went, instead of 12 inches, we put 30 inches in the lid? That saves 30 gallons of oil, and that costs a few $100. Go ahead. You know, up here we have a thing where if we need ventilation, we just don't open our windows because, well, when it's cold out, you don't want 30 below air just coming into your house. So we have something called heat recovery ventilators. So these are little mechanical units that bring in two fans, one fan that sucks fresh air, another fan that blows out stale air, and there's a heat exchanger in the middle that can recuperate some of that air. So rather than just blowing out all your warm air, it puts some of the heat into the incoming airstream. But just by adding one of those in this house here in Fairbanks in that picture, that offset 153 gallons of oil. Next slide. Oh, I missed a slide there. We also found that the point actually is really clear here that I'm trying to make is that, you know, the impact of energy efficiency, you know, not only does it use less energy and fewer, you know, greenhouse gases, it also saves money. So really, what's to lose? You know, what can we do to make an impact? Like Terry said, you know, like my daughter said, you know, well, what are you doing about it? The way we look at it is energy efficiency really is a powerful approach. And I would suggest that, you know, if there are some action items, I would encourage energy efficiency legislation, you know, especially as it pertains to houses and transportation. That all goes back into getting people engaged, like Terry was saying, getting them to vote. You know, housing is a pretty unique because it's a powerful tool because it shelters us from the elements and it's essential. But when we build sustainably and we encompass a holistic approach to address local climate, cultural needs, energy efficiency, reduced resources and materials, and even save money, then we're really tackling the climate change problem. Maybe think about Terry's. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Excuse me. Terry's slide that he was showing us about the ecological footprint reminds me because, you know, I built a net zero house, and one day, it was this year, I was dropping my kids off at the bus stop, and we were talking about the climate change issue, you know, and my buddy Pete, he says, you know, Bruno, he says, you know, if everyone just lived like you and I did, we'd have it all set. And I kind of thought, oh, okay, yeah, I guess that kind of feels good, you know. It was kind of a nice pat on the back. Went to work, went through all the day, and then that night at 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up, and those words came in to haunt me. I was thinking that just doesn't quite sit right. And so I got online and I looked up a carbon calculator. So I put in this house, and I put in, it was a pretty good carbon calculator. It asked you all the right questions. How much energy does your house use? What kind of car do you have? What year is it? How many miles do you drive a year? How many people do you live? About how many dollars where do you live? That's a very important question. About how much do you spend a year on food? About how much do you spend a year on manufactured food? So it's a little bit of a guess there, but they asked all the right questions. And when it was all said and done, it gave me a score. And I was a little scared to look at it, because what it says is, if we're going to achieve the threshold, the 1.5 degrees C threshold to that by 2030, the average carbon footprint per capita around the world is 2 tons per year of carbon per person. Right now, the average is at 5. And in America, the average is, I think, it's about 15, and in Alaska, it's closer to 40. The score that I got for our household of 4 was 28, and it made me think, oh God, what do we do about that? But the solution there was a solution there, and I know we'll talk about it soon, but it's carbon offsets, and the carbon offsets are things where you pay plant trees in Kenya or invest in green energy or things like that. But those offsets are about $10 a ton. So for about $280 a year, I can offset my 28 tons a year that my family uses to fly to the East Coast or whatnot. And there's a statement there that says, reduce where you can, offset the rest. And so I didn't mean to tell that story, but thank you, Terry, for bringing it up. Anyway, again, back to Annabelle's assertion, we're all trying to solve climate change, but we're just staring at plastic screens. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bruno, for delivering that from your net zero house. So that was great. That was another perspective. And now to wrap up, we have a voice from the younger generation. We have Nanieezh Peters, who's going to be giving us her viewpoint.
Asi, Shojri Nanieezh Peter Ojri Vashran Ko Gotan Ithli Gatanan Guichi Shahan Enei Sat Shiti Ivan Peter. Hello, my name is Nanieezh Peter, and I am Netzai Gwachin and Navajo. My parents are Enei and Yvonne Peter, and I go to West Valley. I was in the newspaper a while ago for a resolution that I helped write, and these are some photos of West Valley students, along with FE students and some Hutch students, holding a rally. I know. Holding a rally to show that the youth of Fairbanks are in this climate crisis as well, and it's our futures. And we need the adults and the administrators and all the heads of our state to notice us and acknowledge that they need to change the way that they are running our state and the whole entire world, because they're risking all of us. And so that's why we put together this rally. And it was me and Sophia Miller and Quanah Potts and a lot of other great upperclassmen at West Valley and FE as well.
Across the sea, you guys did it.
Oh yeah. And this is with so Greta Thunberg, and she started the Fridays for Our Future. And so this was one of the Fridays that Fairbanks participated in, and it's every Friday youth around the world hold a rally or a strike or just take a photo of themselves with a sign, and it's grown hugely. It's really big now, and so Fairbanks youth are in support of that movement, and I think that the rally went really well. We weren't expecting as many people to show up as did, and we were really thankful that so many people showed up, because it also showed how much people power we can have in Fairbanks, or youth-driven power we can have in Fairbanks. And so it was inspiring, not only to me, but I think to a lot of the youth as well, because it was a defining moment where we were stepping up into having a voice. And that was really, really powerful. Anyway, that was the Fairbanks Friday for Our Future rally that we held at West Valley on the track field. And so that was one of the things that I participated in with our local youth. And oh yeah, we can go to the next slide now. This is another thing that I participated in as a youth protector of my Indigenous lands and my culture as well. This was at AFN, the Alaska Federation of Natives, and it's when our regions come together. So a lot of people from the different regions of Alaska come together and we discuss different issues involving our people and how to move forward with them. There's a lot of resolutions that come to the table during this time. And so me and some Indigenous youth, including Quanah Potts and Zoe Okliasik and Allison Banky, we wrote a resolution, and it was titled Emergency Declaration. It was about, oh gosh, one second. Climate emergency. It was trying to declare a climate emergency within AFN. It did declare, yes, it passed after a long debate on the floor of AFN. It got kind of heated, I suppose you could say. Yeah, so this is a photo of me and Quanah Potts and my dad, Yvonne Peter, and we were on the floor standing in front of this microphone talking to the, who do you call the people we were talking to, Mom?
They were all elected leaders.
Elected leaders, yeah.
And just leaders of Alaska Native.
Mm-hmm. And so we were stating our resolution, stating our case as to why we wanted the resolution to pass. And it was not even like a want, it was a need. We needed the resolution to pass because so much is at risk. And so in this photo, I started crying up there. And Quanah was really supportive, and then my dad came up, and that was really emotional and really empowering again. And the resolution did pass on the floor, and it was a huge moment. I don't think I realized how big it was at the moment. I just thought we had taken a win. But it was like all the youth around the world who are fighting for this took a win as well. And so I feel really grateful to have been there and to have helped push the resolution to the floor and pass it. And so,
What did it do?
Oh, the resolution, what did it do? My mom's over here asking me questions. Yeah.
So we got the sun really right now.
Yeah, okay. Ooh. So the resolution, we talked about the importance of protecting our Indigenous ways of life and the animals and the plants and the land. And so the resolution said that AFN would declare a state of emergency and they would stop hurting the earth, and
They would build a task force.
they would build a task force, yes. Yeah, the task force, a youth task force, and other people from the regions as well would be on the task force. And so the task force could hopefully go to meetings that AFN had with different industries and sort of be there to give input and show that the youth do have a voice in this and that it is our future and we need to be seen and heard and acknowledged. And so that was the point of the state of emergency for climate change AFN resolution. And it's not just like this one thing happened and it passed and now it's gonna just be done with. It's follow through. And so I've been communicating with them and figuring out how we can get the task force together and who's going to be on it and how the logistics of all of that will work. And it's something I learned from this is that fighting for something you feel strongly about isn't a one-time thing. You can't just do one big thing and be a one-hit wonder in that sort of way. It has to be a follow-through, and you have to continue to have the hopefulness, but also the engagement and the motivation to keep moving forward and working with others, and just a lot of love, I guess, as well. Like you have to be, you have to hold a lot of love to do stuff like this. And I really admire all the youth and everyone who is working to protect my future, my little sister's futures, everyone's future, in this work that they're doing. So just thank you to everyone in that. And then, oh yeah, what? Next slide, please. Okay, so working in this sort of thing, I guess, in protecting the earth can really take a toll on your mental health. And so as an Indigenous youth, growing up with a climate crisis, having to deal with schools not teaching about me and not being able to connect with people in the textbooks that I read, and then on top of that, being stuck in isolation, which I'm thankful for all the healthcare workers out there and everyone who is just helping us all pull through in this hard time. And so all these things can take a toll on your mental health. And when I was younger, especially, I would have nightmares about climate change and a sense of feeling alone. And it's hurtful. And so I've been working through ways to cope with those feelings of aloneness and the depression of having to be pushing for something that sometimes feels like no one's listening. And so one of my coping skills is planting seeds. And we have a ton of starters over here. You can't really see them. But this is one of them. And these are my nasturtiums, and then some flowers in the little box behind them. And they just started sprouting. And I love to eat food from our garden. I think that's a coping skill, not like binge eating, but you know, eating things that you've nurtured, and that sounds awful. Okay.
Eating our own food, yeah.
Eating your own food, eating locally. That's just it's comfort food. It makes me feel good. It gives me warmth and motivation to continue writing resolutions and doing all these other things that really need to be done. And so eating local is not only good for my mental health, but it is also good for our economy. And in the way that we are going, if we want to end climate change and save the world, then we're going to need to start eating local and supporting our local farmers and local businesses, because they're the ones who are going to be here for us when Amazon fails, yeah. When big industries like that can no longer be open because they ship too much and they're polluting too much. And so support local, I'm all for that. Yeah, lots of love. And talking about planting seeds and supporting locally, I also, more coping skills, I guess, is like meditation and focusing on where you are and being present is a good one. And getting into this work is planting a seed. So writing the resolution was a seed for me that I planted. And now I'm busy, you know, watering it and making sure it's growing. But it's it's keeping me motivated and ready to see it grow, I guess. I'm ready to see it bloom, and hopefully people see it and then get their hearts filled with a little bit of love. and also motivation to start their own resolution, or go out and plant their own garden, or go out and shop locally. And so that's me. That's what I like to do. And so getting youth involved is also really big. And if you are a youth on this watching right now, I really support you checking out Native Movement and FCAC, and listening to Terry speak more, and all these people who have been in this longer than we have. But also not being afraid to put your voice out there, and not being afraid to speak up about what you really care for or even need, if that comes to mental health as well. Because it's really important that you sustain yourself so that you can help sustain this work. And so youth involvement, also go for it, just go for it. And to all the older people out there, or people who are in administration offices or heads, I really need you guys to look at me and hear what I'm saying, and hear what all these other youth have been saying, and acknowledge it, but also think about how you can take that into what you're doing and help change our world and your children's world and your grandchildren's world for the better. Because it really comes down to life or death. And I personally want to live. I want to live to grow lots of gardens. And I'm sure that someone's great-grandchild will also love gardens as much as I do, and plants and food. And so I urge you to listen to us as youth, and communicate and connect with us, and let me be maybe a guide as well. Okay, thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Nanieezh. That was terrific. I hope you get a chance to read through the chat, because there were a lot of comments that were coming in that were saying that we really appreciate your leadership, and that was very inspiring. And thank you for all of that. That was just excellent. A great way to end the panel discussion. So now we have about 20 minutes or so to move into a larger forum where you can ask questions. And there have been a number of questions that have been coming in through the chat. I haven't been able to keep up with them, but I think Katie has. And Katie?
Hi.
Hi. So I think you've been able to keep up with the questions and maybe list the ones that we still need to answer. Some of them I know have gotten answered in the chat while things have been going on, but then I know a lot of other questions have come in. And if you have more questions, just type them in here and we'll try to get to them all as we can.
Yeah, there was kind of a flurry of conversation around climate change education, and one more dimension to that, maybe for Enei, on decolonizing work being taught in our schools. And I know there's lots of, if everybody would go to their participant option on the down below. So if you go to the bottom of your screen and you click on participants, you have the option to say yes or no, or to raise your hand. And I just wanted to get a sense, how many of you identify as youth, like age 25 and under? Because Nanieezh was talking right to you. Click that yes button if you identify as a youth. It looks like, all right, okay. So your words were being heard by the young people of our community, Nanieezh. All right, lower your check mark. And I wanted to see how many of you identify as teachers or educators. You're teaching a kindergarten through 16 class. You teach Sunday school. I saw Ken Stenick and Chris Villano on here, Mark, Mike. All right. So we have a lot of experts on here that think about education. What do you think, Nanieezh, you would like to hear more of in school regarding climate change or Native youth voices? And then Eugenie has to unmute you. Yeah.
Okay. So I think in the school, there is not enough curriculum around climate change. And I think the only time that a teacher has mentioned and talked about climate change was this year to me. And it was in my biology class after we held the rally. And then I think maybe it motivated my teacher to talk about it, which I was really happy about. But there definitely isn't enough talked about in the schools. And that ties back to colonization as well. Like, we don't learn about that in the schools. And I would really like to see that changed, because I think it's really important to teach people about themselves and about others and who were here before, and also about where we're going in the future.
Okay. It looks like, so Kendra was curious about what's being taught in Matsu, and I think it's an interesting contrast to Ken. If you could unmute Ken, and Ken, if you're willing to talk a little bit about what motivated you to start teaching about climate change in Shishmaref.
1 second, let me find Ken. There are a lot of people here.
I wonder if it was a student, Nanieezh, that motivated Ken.
All right, I have unmuted Ken.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So a friend of mine from Boston, he does a thing called Climate Stories Project, had set my class up with a classroom in Connecticut. And I remember one of their kids, ultimately, after they got to know each other, asked the question, how does climate change affect you? And, you know, the big topic for years and years in Shishmaref has been erosion. And so one of my kids finally stepped up, you know, because they're very shy here, and said, erosion as a question. And I'm like, man, if our kids aren't climate literate, so they can't tell their story, they can't read information and learn more how it's affecting them, you know, what am I doing as a science teacher, or what can I do as a science teacher to get them so that they are climate literate? So I actually have a climate change class for seniors, because when you look at any of the curriculums out there, it's maybe mentioned in a couple of paragraphs in a chapter in an ecology section, and so you don't, you know, there's not a lot out there. And so, you know, I've been lucky to have like Hayo and Aiken and many others at the university that have worked with me along the way, Elena and Katie included, and Katie G from Homer, you know, all these people I've been lucky to be connected with to help me bring more information into the classroom. So, I mean, that's where I was. I just wanted kids to be able to tell their story here, and because they need to be able to get funding in the future if the village has to relocate. And, you know, there's so much going on that these kids need to be able to be literate regarding climate change to tell their story.
Thanks for sharing that, Ken. So there are some teachers that are pretty passionate about it, and it's pretty exciting to see that movement on climate change education growing in our state. Enei, what about education on colonialism in our state? And what do you think that intersection with climate change?
Well, there's always room. There's definitely room for growing that, for sure. I mean, I don't think that enough is done to really teach about the history of colonialism and its current manifestations and implications. I think there is work being done to incorporate new hiring practices for various institutes across this or entities across the state to understand more of at least Alaska Native history. I think there's been a lot done in Canada to nationalize a kind of training around a history of colonization and Indigenous history. And I say it's all of our history, not just a history of Indigenous people. It is history from an Indigenous perspective, but it's all of our history. But our organization has been doing some trainings and popular education workshops with education institutions and the school district here in Fairbanks to help bring some of those teachings into the school district. There's nothing mandated, so there's a number of really amazing teachers in our school districts that are incorporating a lot of this history, whether it be from Elizabeth Peradovich, understanding who that was, and understanding more of an Indigenous history, but it's not mandated. And so it's really comes down to kind of those teachers that go above and beyond to include that knowledge into our school systems. And it's really, beneficial to all students. It's of course beneficial to Native students to be able to see themselves in the education curriculum, but it's beneficial to all students to learn this history. So more can be done, in short. Needs to be done.
Yeah. Terry, this is a question for you from Carla. Carla asks, the oil industry has spent a lot of money and effort working on the narrative that we as people and consumers are at fault because we did not recycle enough or bike to work enough, and therefore climate change is our fault. What can we do in respects to policy or alternative solutions that doesn't put the full onus on isolated individual actions? So Terry, how do we balance this idea of personal action versus policy change?
I think that's a wonderful question. It's personal actions I feel are absolutely essential, but they need to be personal actions in terms of what we do as consumers, as purchasers. They need to be personal actions as how we participate in the political system and encourage our leaders to make socially responsible decisions. It's personal actions like Nanieezh was talking about, being out there in front and making things happen, speaking out loudly. That's a wonderful example of personal actions. And I think there's ways in which if we behave in ways that are consistent with our beliefs about the importance of climate change, things can change, things could turn around quickly. And so we don't need to worry about blaming ourselves, but just thinking about what we would want to do to have a better life that isn't as damaging to climate. And if we make choices that favor the education of our kids, for example, rather than purchasing more stuff, then businesses that specialize in providing educational curricula will then have economic benefits over those businesses that produce new stuff. And so if there's ways in which the economic system will adjust to the things that individual consumers and individual people do. And so I think it is substantially up to us as individuals to make those changes. But at the same time, there's policies that reinforce the existing patterns of consumption. Things like subsidies to companies that drill for fossil fuels, subsidies for, or lack of subsidies, insufficient subsidies for renewable energy. So I think it's important to change laws and regulations in ways that are compatible with the kinds of changes that individuals might wish to make in promoting a more sustainable climate.
Thanks, Terry. I'm going to go to Eugenie. There's two people that have their hand raised in our participant list. Kat Haber, do you want to live question?
See if I can find them. Yes, 1 second.
Okay.
This doesn't show up online for some reason here. Kat, is that right?
Yeah.
That's...
In the meantime, Bruno, how do people get in touch with, I don't know if Bruno can unmute himself either. It's all on.
Yes. Oh, wait, 1 second. Okay, I did find Kat, by the way. All right.
Kat, get ready. The anticipation's building.
Bruno, okay, I unmuted you. Oh, wait, and then it muted you back again. There you go.
Okay. Bruno,
Can you hear me? I'm here.
Yes, yes.
Kat done. We had a couple of questions. One is from Stanley Edwin, and he was curious about what sort of air exchange systems, and I think he want to know more about aerosols both inside and outside, and what you guys do to manage that.
I think I'm understanding the question. You're saying what do the, like what I was talking about, HRVs, heat recovery ventilators, does that do anything to manage aerosols? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I'd say no. It's a little difficult. So indoor aerosols, if it's which can be created through cooking, yes, it dumps it outside of the house. So that makes it a safer, healthier indoor air quality and healthier place to live. So in that way, yes, it does sort of clean the environment in which in your house there. Doesn't do anything about anything may come from outside to inside, but that's not usually the source of the pollutant. Is that the kind of the directions you're?
Yeah, I think
question here.
To his very first question that he posed, but as Eugenie looks for Stanley to unmute him.
Oh, I unmuted Kat. Kat, what was your question?
Yeah, but look for Stanley Edward next.
Okay, all right, good. All right, go ahead, Kat.
My question is, if all of the panelists could imagine the world in 2030, what would it look like from your perspective, from an Alaskan perspective in 2030?
All right, let's start with Eldridge first, Terry.
Okay, I imagine in 2030 that people will be either not using cars, but using more public transportation, or if they do need a car, it will be an electric car. People will be buying food and growing food locally rather than depending entirely on a globalized food network that depends on massive amounts of transportation. And people will be more in charge of their lives, of trying to understanding that it's important that they make a positive contribution to the way society moves forward, that they'll be thinking more about what their children need than about what makes them feel comfortable. I could go on, but that's enough.
Okay, we'll move on to Bruno, and I'm not assuming that Bruno's older than you, Enei.
You know, in a lot of ways, the rest of the lower 48 looks to Alaska as a model for, the canary in the coal mine, right? So they look to us for examples of how to solve these problems. In a lot of ways, if we can solve them on a micro scale, like if we could solve this problem, and I could see, this is where I'm going with it. What if we were able to take these villages that, groups of people who've been here for thousands of years and become the model for what sustainable life is, when it comes to renewable energy and sustainable, construction and growing gardens. To me, I think that's what I could see happening in 2030. And it's not off the charts yet either, because, we're moving whole villages at a time right now. Muktavic is being relocated from Newtok and is an opportunity to start from scratch. And there are a number of villages saying, and even reach out to us and said, we want to be 100% renewable. How can we do that? I could see that happening in many places across Alaska in 2030.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What I would like to see, tribal governments be in the forefront of participating in shaping solutions for our communities, not corporations, tribal governments. And I think if we're recognizing tribal government sovereignty on this land, we would be building better communities for us all. I think also, I would like to see, I don't know if I think radical shift and transformation is possible, and we're seeing that right now. So I'm gonna let go also of my what's possible mind, because we are seeing right now radical shift and change in 3 weeks, right? So in 10 years, I would hope that we as a state, we're not continuing to be the fossil fuel resource, the extractive resource site for the rest of the country and the world. I would like to see us not be the sacrifice zone for the rest of the world. I would like us to build economies that aren't dependent on industries that only take and then perpetuate climate instability. So I would like to see us build local sustainable economies that really feed back into our communities and that are really have tribal partnerships at the forefront. And that includes things like, our food systems, building homes that are more energy efficient, renewable energy, education systems that teach regenerative economies. So that's what I would like to see.
How about you?
I would like to see, there's a lot I would like to see change.
Let's see, in 10 years,
In 10 years, I'll be
26.
26. I would like to see myself in college, in a college where they are teaching Indigenous languages and Indigenous knowledge, and on a college where I could go to a market and pick out what I'm gonna have for dinner, hopefully not ramen noodles, at a college where there's renewable energy, so maybe there's solar panels, and a college where there's tons of different classes I could choose, and they're very inclusive and diverse, and a college with lots of colors to keep people happy. That's what I would like to see in 10 years.
Beautiful vision.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Zucchini, I think that Katie Gavanis's question is a great wrap-up question. And
Okay. Yeah, that's like,
if we could get everybody, there's been some requests in the private chat, Eugenie, to post this video, but in order to do that, I just want everybody to give some sort of sign of consent that they are willing to share this online. So if you could, on your
2018 award in this Oscar category.
raise your hand.
Yes. Types of these. Daniel, what are bombs? No.
Yes, as people are giving their consent to this.
Swords. Kayla, back to you.
oh,
Menu 600, please.
Duncan.
Eugenie, what is our next step? What's the future for this effort?
yeah, so that's a good question. And so initially, there was a lot of work involved in getting this Solve Climate by 2030 event organized because it was a nationwide effort. And so that was our first step, was to get every state, well, we had 45 states in the end participating and holding these dialogues today and coming up with local plans and actions that we can partake in a feasible manner. And so right now, I will say that we have plans to make more plans to initiate further action. And those aren't concrete, and the committee for this Solve Climate is going to meet in the short term to discuss how to go next. But I will say that we have all of your email addresses, and many of you have said that you would like to have further communication from us in the future regarding what will be going on in this arena. And so we will stay in contact with you and let you know how things unfold. But right now, we don't have any concrete plans. I think we will in the future. And I will also say that we have discussed today ways that you can start thinking about what to do. And so I would urge you all to continue to do that and to take action however you can. And so with that, I think that we should probably wrap up now. And I would like to thank all of our panelists. I can quickly unmute everyone and we can maybe clap for them. How does that sound?
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
And a reprise of Arabian.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
And that takes you up to 4,600. You're safely installed in second place. And Sophie is the one going first in double jeopardy.